Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you all here with us again today. Thank you for joining us. Doing something slightly different today. Both Chloe and I are dialing into the webinar from home. We're practicing what we preach, but hopefully you'll still have the same good quality experience that we've had in previous webinars. So we're delighted again to welcome Chloe Chambrode as our guest speaker today. As most of you will know, Chloe is the Gender Equality Director at Business Community and is incredibly passionate about achieving gender equality both at work and in life. And I know some of you follow Chloe on LinkedIn, and I would urge you to do that after the webinar today, actually, if you don't already. Chloe shares some fabulous insights into diversity and gender diversity in particular. This is the last webinar that we'll run with Business in the Community ahead of this year's reporting deadline. We're hoping to run some more events after April. And we very much tried to follow the process of getting to grips with your gender pay gap and offered guidance on understanding the causes of your pay gap. And then we've looked at in more detail at the actions that you can take to improve. So what I'll do at the end of this, as it's the last webinar, is I'll include links to all previous webinars in a slide at the end, and you'll get that as we circulate the slide deck. But I would also urge you to, when you get the follow-up email with the recording, there will be a link to a feedback form. Please do use the feedback form to let us know what topics you would like us to cover in the coming year. So today's webinar looks at the final step really in the gender pay gap process, but there isn't really a final step. I mean, I say final step with regards to a gender pay gap reporting year, but tackling your gender pay gap is obviously an ongoing cycle that will evolve over time, but we're looking at it in the context of a reporting year. So what we're going to look at today is how you communicate your pay gap kind of internally and externally, and look at some research that we've carried out on action plans. And I guess this will be even more important in the second year of reporting. I'll hand you over to Chloe, who's going to give you a quick introduction to Business and Community now.
Thank
Chloe,
you, Tara. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I hope you can see our slides. So do not hesitate to follow us on Twitter as well, if you want to. So just for those of you who don't know Business in the Community, we are the Prince's Responsible Business Network. And we've been working for over 35 years now with a lot of employers. In the gender campaign, we have 150 employers. And through this network, we cover 4 million people, which is quite incredible when you think about it. I know some of our partners are joining us today, so very warm welcome to you all. Just to give you an overview of the work we do across the board, if you look at the Responsible Business Map, we do work on diversity and inclusion, but it's not the only work we do. We also use some tools such as the Responsible Business Tracker to look at how you are doing across the board. And we are about to launch a diagnostic tool called Diversity Intelligence that you can use at no extra cost if you're a partner to diagnose the driving factors behind your pay gap. So we very much look at the analysis and the data in order to understand the gaps and also the areas where you might be leading the way, to use that to inform your strategy. We cover a lot of different issues. Gender is only one of them, but we work very closely with our partners from the race, well-being, age and employment campaigns to make sure that the approach we take is intersectional. So just to give you an example, the ethnicity pay gap reporting, the consultation has just closed. At BITC, we have published our gender pay gap by ethnicity, and we're really looking to see how we can learn from the gender pay gap reporting cycle to see how we can advise employers on ethnicity pay gap reporting as well, for those who want to do it voluntarily. So let's talk about how it went last year. So you may know that last year employers had to report, and you have probably, a lot of you have reported. And I think what was a bit surprising for me was to see that only 50% of employers had published a narrative alongside their pay gap figures, which is actually quite low, and we expected this number to be higher at Business in the Community. I have to say most of our members have published a narrative, which was really reassuring and quite interesting to read. But often many of the narratives we've read in the public domain were too high level or too little detail. So to give you an example, the typical sentence that I read in gender pay gap reports is we have an underrepresentation of women in senior roles. And to me, this is just a description of the symptom rather than trying to tackle the causes of the gender pay gap, which would be, why is it that you have fewer women in senior roles? Is it because women work part-time and it's hard to progress when you work part-time? Is it that, you know, the recruitment process is not quite is quite biased? So I really encourage employers to go beyond the mere figures and try and understand what's driving the pay gap.
And I would reiterate that as well, Chloe. And I know from a government perspective, we're really encouraging employers to publish a narrative and action plan this year, and really to think about and investigate the causes of the gender pay gap within the business, because there are broad causes, and we'll see that slide in the presentation here, but they will differ in where and how they occur in different businesses. So it's really important that you understand the causes of your gender pay gap. And Chloe, you and I did a webinar on that in the recent past, and we'll have the links to that as well.
Yes, absolutely. And we also have a list of 10 questions in our toolkit number 2 on understanding, on analyzing the gender pay gap. And the Government Equalities Office has also published some really good guidance. So there are some sort of checklists and questions you can answer that will really help you dig into the causes of those pay gaps. If we move to the action plan, which was also optional, just like the narrative accompanying the figures, the action plan, there were only 20% of employers who had published an action plan with timeline and target-driven activities. And this is from research conducted by the Equality and Human Rights Commission earlier this year. And what they found is that there were very few employers who had published targets that they could use to measure their progress from one year to the next. So again, if you can publish an action plan with timelines and with target-driven activities, that's going to make a huge difference in terms of the message you are sending out to your workforce, but also to the general public. I also wanted to mention the example of the Greater London Authority. I think that this is so far one of the best action plans I've seen. You will see that they have 16 actions, if I remember correctly. And against each action is a timeline to say when they're going to get it done and how they will know they have succeeded. So it's a really good example to look at if you want to have this at hand to get some inspiration for your own pay gap, because we know it can be quite difficult to write such a narrative. So why does it matter to publish a narrative? A lot of employers have not done it, and they probably had reasons for it, but it matters because we conducted some research and found that 92% of respondents would look at the gender pay gap data when choosing between two employers. And obviously, we assume at the time we didn't know if the narrative would be in the publication or not, but we assume that employees who are looking for jobs in those organizations will look at the report. So they won't just look at the gender pay gap, they will also look at what the organization is doing to close it. And this is very much reflected in the second figure, that half of female respondents would favor the company with the smallest pay gap or the one that is most active in closing it and most proactive. So I think it's really important that even though you have a pay gap, and even though this pay gap may be increasing for very good reasons, for instance, if you are in the engineering sector and you want to recruit more women into entry-level roles, that means your pay gap is going to increase because you are paying more women with lower salaries. But actually it's a really good thing, because in the long term those women are going to progress and you're going to solve the pay gap in the long term. So again, I would really encourage that we look beyond figures, and I'm really confident that employees will be looking at the narrative as well when they make their choice.
And I would agree with that. Sorry,
Yeah.
Chloe, I'm putting in there. I would agree with that as well. I think yes, we're in second year of reporting now. We're coming up to the next deadline, and we will see fluctuations in pay gaps from some businesses because they've taken action to improve gender balance in the long term and not kind of just short-term fixed actions. So the narrative and action plan is a really good opportunity to tell that story and to highlight that story, and it's really important that businesses do that. So very, very, very quickly, actually, most of you will know or have heard of the Government Equalities Office, but if you haven't, this is a slide that outlines the work that we do, and of course, one of the main areas that we cover that we're responsible for is the gender pay gap regulations. Encouragingly, the gender pay gap has reduced slightly. These are from the ONS figures from October, so that's really positive. And again, the government, I don't think we're expecting to see massive reductions in the gender pay gap after 1 year of reporting. And I know some of you will have seen and potentially be worried about the recent press, which focused on those that have already reported the gender pay gap and the fact that some of them have increased. This will be the reality for some businesses, and we expect that. Others, your pay gap may not have shifted at all. So I think the key message we're trying to get across here is in the webinar today is how you communicate your gender pay gap in a meaningful way that illustrates your commitment to action and change. And as Chloe just highlighted as well, it's all about kind of highlighting your commitment and highlighting the good work that you're doing, that you have been doing, and you're planning to do. Just a gentle reminder that we have some deadlines coming up. We have the public sector deadline on the 30th of March, and for private sector organisations, the reporting deadline is the 4th of March this year, so not long to go. So April, excuse me, thanks Chloe, the 4th of April, as it says on the slide. Thanks, Chloe. So look, I'd urge you to do a couple of things ahead of the deadline. Check a couple of things really. If you're responsible for reporting your figures, please log back into your account and make sure kind of everything is ready to report. The correct users are set up. That you've added any new users, or that you have added all your legal entities that you're required to report under. So any businesses with 250 or more employees. If your company is reporting for the first time, please make sure that you're registered with the reporting service in good time ahead of the deadline, because you'll have to receive fast-track codes for security verification, and they will come along in the post, so that will take a few days. So please do that as soon as possible. I'd like to point out a new feature of the reporting service this year, which will help everyone, I hope, is that you can save a draft of your report. So you can go and input your figures and your report, save that draft and do that ahead of time. And then once you get the sign-off that you need internally, so senior sign-off, then you can just go and click a button to publish the report. That should make the process a lot easier. And also to point out that we have 3 very short webinars happening next week, which I'll provide links to, which runs through the reporting process. So for anyone who's new to that or who would like a refresher. Just again, we've seen this slide before if you've been in our webinars. What causes the gender pay gap? And these are some of the causes, the broad causes of the gender pay gap. You'll see there, you're familiar with the fact that women tend to work in occupations that are female dominated and perhaps lower paid, or work in lower paying sectors as well. And the labour market history is one that's stark there. So women spend more time out of work for caring, and actually they receive on average 2% reduction in early wage for each year taken out of employment. Some of this will exist within your business. All of it might exist within your business and will be driving your gender pay gap. So I guess the message that we're trying to get across with all of our guidance and support, it's important that you investigate what's driving your gender pay gap. It's best practice to do this. I think you'll agree with that, Chloe. Kind of to do that either before or kind of alongside the development of your narrative and action plan. And it'll give your efforts to drive change a much better chance of success if you understand where those issues lie. So GEO undertook some research in 2018 really to understand the processes that companies went through whenever they were producing their action plan. So as Chloe mentioned, roughly 50% of businesses who reported GPG figures last year reported an action plan or a statement of intent with varying levels of detail. And again, to stress that government are asking employers to develop and publish an action plan to improve gender balance and tackle the gender pay gap within their businesses. So I would urge you to, if you're not already thinking about doing that, to start thinking about that. So with the research that we undertook, we had a partner in this, OMB, and we looked at 50 action plans in detail, 51 actually, and we held 12 focused interviews. And we looked at some key areas. So what was the motivation for developing the plan? What was the approach to diagnosing the causes of the gender pay gap, the action plan development process, what decisions were made about content, and were there any plans to kind of evaluate the action plans once in place. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the findings of that before I hand you back to Chloe. So the research team were able to identify some clear factors that were integral to the success of a strong action plan, I guess, being published. No surprises really here. You see, involving a wide range of stakeholders, gaining senior leadership support is obviously really important. Taking a systematic approach to diagnosing the gender pay gap so that it was clear that it was being understood exactly where the problems lay. Planning the approach in detail, allowing sufficient time for the process, and that came up a number of times actually, that the process took much longer. Process of kind of getting sign off to develop an action plan, developing the action plan, drafting it, and then getting sign off again took much longer than everyone, I think almost everyone had thought. Accessing external assistance were available, so that's your membership organisations like Business in the Community, allowing space for the plan to evolve over time, and embedding your gender pay gap action plan into existing and ongoing diversity and inclusion strategies. So they were identified as key areas for success, but there were some barriers. Most of the respondents did feel that they successfully completed the development of an action plan, but and I guess none of them felt that these challenges were surmountable, but they were highlighted as challenges. And again, time to do it justice, and to plan and monitor and evaluate the plan was highlighted as a key issue. And also, senior management buy-in again, as we said, is required for success. But management at other levels was highlighted as a potential blocker from many of the respondents. And part of that was down to competing priorities and difficulty in getting line managers to give sufficient time to this. It was the first year of a new regulation, I guess, and perhaps not allowing enough time, as already mentioned. But a couple of examples also highlighted, I guess, misunderstanding of the issue around what companies were trying to do. So a couple of people highlighted that line managers and middle management were unwilling to get involved because they were worried that they'd have to hire less suitable candidates. So I think that really highlights the importance of internal communication at every stage of this, and really making sure that those who need to have input into the action plan and actually delivering the action plan are aware of the benefits that gender diversity will bring to the business and to their kind of core business area. I think you probably agree with me on that, Chloe.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to look at a couple of key areas that came out of the research. So the first thing was what triggered the development of an action plan. And again, there's no surprises here. Publishing the gender pay gap was the main prompt to develop or refine existing action plans. So, and this is something that we'll talk about again, but it's worth doing. But in many cases, existing policies and kind of more formalised diversity and inclusion strategies were redeveloped to include GPG action plans where suitable, so where that was possible. And companies illustrated that they wanted to demonstrate, I guess, that they were placing importance on the issue of reducing the gender pay gap, and they wanted you to deliver this in a digestible format that kind of customers, I guess, clients, and employees and the wider public could taken. And in some cases, and many of you will be familiar with this, the size of the gender pay gap then prompted quicker action and board level conversations about how the action had to be driven throughout the business. And I think, many of the HR directors here will be familiar with that conversation. You've been talking about change, and hopefully the gender pay gap reporting helped be the catalyst for driving that change. So I guess
Tara,
a takeaway from this, yeah.
Just to add here that there was a really interesting research published by US and Denmark, academics from the US and Denmark, who found that there is a real effect when you are doing mandatory pay gap reporting. They looked at the companies who had done it in 2006, and they found that it really creates a real shift in how people operate, and that the organization who had to report for sort of legal reasons managed to close their pay gap a lot faster than those who didn't. So it's the first piece of evidence we have to date that shows a real effect. So I'm quite hopeful that the same will happen in the UK.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, and I saw that research. Thank you for highlighting that, Chloe. So I guess the main takeaway from the section here that we're talking about is it's important to review your existing policies and strategies and see what work could be added to or developed further to improve the gender pay gap, and bringing in other areas of the business that will be impacted from that at the earliest stage possible, I guess. Again, we're looking at who was a decision maker in deciding to develop an action plan and narrative. And again, there'll be no surprises here. The decision was made in lots of different ways, but HR was pivotal to the decision in all cases, really. In some cases, HR had the authority to go off and do the action plan and the autonomy to do that and develop it and present it to the business. I think in the majority of cases, it was senior leaders who made the decisions, but HR had an awful lot of input into that. The process in some cases was quick, but actually in many cases it was protracted because, we've talked about the availability of senior leaders and senior stakeholders. And in a few cases of the respondents that came through, they took a different approach in that they put together a wider business working group to make decisions based on, established protocols within the business, impact on other policies, cost-benefit analysis, which I guess led to a protracted process, but also led to some strong debate about, from different stakeholders about what should be included in the action plan. And actually, the respondents that came through and took this approach really welcomed that diversity of thinking and felt that their action plan was a lot more robust because of that. And also, lots of the respondents, consulted external bodies, again, such as Business and Community or HR consultants to help and assist with how, what kind of action plan they should develop and what content should be in there. I think, again, back to building time, the main point here is build time into the process. And if you can, consult wider business, and that will give you a stronger, more robust action plan. And I guess following on from that, the approach that businesses took on whether to develop an action plan then usually followed into what content will be put in the plan. So if it was a more formal, structured, wider business approach on whether to decide to develop an action plan in the first place, that approach then flowed through to what content would be within that action plan then as well. And again, we're looking at how companies approached diagnosing the causes of their gender pay gap and putting that within the action plan. And we saw three approaches, as you'll see here. So very quickly, cursory and narrow approach really was a quick and basic analysis of gender pay gap data only. Kind of an informed common sense approach, I guess, based on prior knowledge of the business and potentially sector. And these respondents felt they already had a good understanding, so they were able to quickly work out what the problem was and put some actions in place to resolve those problems. Then we get to more in-depth, kind of detailed and narrow analysis, but again, only on GPG data. But these respondents indicated that they kind of analysed the data, cut it and recut it in lots of different ways to really get to the issues that were driving the pay gap. And in many cases, this work directly informed development of specific measures to tackle that, but actually that wasn't the main driver. The main driver was wanting to be able to explain the gender pay gap publicly, and in a way that I guess painted the company in a strong light, really. And the third approach we saw was kind of more detailed and wide-ranging, where GPG analysis, gender pay gap analysis, was combined with other data. Companies indicated that they looked at different things like, leavers and joiners at different pay grades and the gender breakdown there, gender split and flexible working uptake or training. And I guess, whilst we're not here to prescribe how you develop your action plans, if you've been to our previous webinars, you will know that we do advocate having a deeper understanding of where your pay gap is coming from. This in-depth analysis will give you, I guess, more of a chance of success in tackling gender pay gap and achieving better gender balance across the business. And again, to point out, it's really useful to look at what other companies are doing with regards to their action plan. But your action plan will be tailored to your specific business, your size, your requirements and your needs at that point in time. But it's really good to look at what other businesses are doing there. And then we saw a variety of approaches with regards to publishing action plans also. And they fell into three main areas here, which you can see on the slide. I'll not read those out. But a point to note is that lots of respondents did have two versions of their action plan. So one which was public facing, which set out kind of the main aims, the commitment to take an action, showed a level of understanding of the gender pay gap, and talked about what actions that the company would take. But then most companies had an internally facing document which had way more detail, talked about lines of accountability, and perhaps had targets. And this was used extensively for kind of internal communications and communications with senior members of staff. But what came through in the research was, and again, pushing this point again, the vast majority of respondents really considered transparency and openness with staff to be really important in helping and getting buy-in to reduce the gender pay gap. I think we'll look at the development process that came through in the research. Again, not many surprises here. I think, there was lots of different ways of doing this, but the process broadly followed standard strategy development stages that you'll see here. The difference really was in the formality of the approach, and what we saw was the formality of the approach usually dictated the level of detail in the plan. So the more formal and structured the approach, the more detailed an action plan that came out the other side of it. And again, no surprises there. I think the approach of taking working groups, getting them involved, having committees and having steering groups and formal feedback usually led to a more comprehensive plan. If we point out the analysis and research stage there, some employers indicated, and I've put that out in a little pop right there, some employers took a very systematic approach to developing their actions. And again, that's something that we talked about in our Diagnosing the Gender Pay Gap webinar. So they looked at the entire employee life cycle, from kind of recruitment right through to induction, to access to support and the appraisal system, the reward systems and employee satisfaction and engagement, and really tried to delve into what factors in each of those areas could be influencing the gender pay gap at each stage of an employee life cycle. And they felt that this, excuse me, allowed them to go much further than kind of the immediately obvious things like, oh, we're going to look at flexible working, and it really allowed them to assess look at the impact that the GPG could be having in other areas of the business. And I think that was a good, strong, robust approach to take, really. And then I think all respondents, I think the majority of them, if not all, reported that they had undergone consultation of some description. The methods varied, but there was definitely consultation involved in all aspects of it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, diversity of thought it was felt by many really improved the action plans that were coming out the other end of it. And I think as well it came through that it was at this stage that this analysis stage that some of the businesses started to engage more widely with staff. I think, and again, the approach differed, you know, engaging with line managers first, and then engaging with staff second, or engaging with everyone at once. But I think that came through that collaboration in the wider business was very useful at this stage. And then plans for monitoring and evaluation of action plans. I think everybody who responded reported that they would have some form of monitoring in place to, I guess, evaluate the success of the action plans. But everyone accepted and pointed out that they felt that the GPG Gender Pay Gap Action Plan was very much an evolution, and is something that would change and develop and grow as reporting, I guess, year on year came through. And again, that, you know, we were at the first year of reporting, so that's a very sensible approach. So some organisations indicated that they would have kind of more informal, regular engagement with management to discuss how things were going without actually implementing formal measures. In some cases, the businesses already had kind of more formal monitoring and evaluation mechanisms in place because they already had diversity and inclusion plans in place, and they were planning to embed GPG in there. And then the slide here, as you'll see, highlights some of the kind of more formal mechanisms that employers indicated that they would take to monitor on an ongoing basis action plans. And you see here, and you can peruse these on the slides here, but some of them were setting targets. Some of them were reporting to equality and inclusion groups, and had gender pay gap embedded in HR reviews, for example. Sorry, just skip the slide ahead there. So again, on evaluation, I think the key theme through all of the research that there was no one set approach that jumped out. However, everyone was planning to evaluate. I think one thing that was clear was that there was no actual firm targets to reduce the gender pay gap at this stage. Employers felt that it was difficult to predict the gender pay gap response to actions in year one, and they didn't want to publicly set targets that were either not ambitious enough or too ambitious. So really what they indicated was they were really focused on improving working practices and getting the right actions that would actually help tackle the problems within their business, and then improving overall gender balance, and actually saying that they were going to reduce the gender pay gap by X amount this year. However, some businesses have, I know the BBC have set out to eradicate their gender pay gap by 2020. So some businesses have certainly set some ambitious targets on that. But I guess, and measurement as well, very much varied. Some took the approach that they would actually measure specific actions that they would put in place. So the uptake of flexible working, for example. Some took the approach that they would gather more qualitative information from committees and steering groups. And again, an even more informal approach in some businesses was ongoing dialogue again, with managers on the implementation of policies and how they were being received, I suppose, on the ground.
Tara, I'm just thinking, we have about 10 minutes left, 15 minutes left, or 10 minutes left, is it? So shall I maybe give some examples about the narrative so that we have enough time to also present the case study? So
absolutely, Chloe, yeah, go ahead.
Basically, this is just a sort of recipe for success. If you want to write a really good narrative, obviously the pay gap figures are statutory, but we really recommend that you add all of these other components in your narrative. So the causes of the gender pay gap, and you can do that using the guidance that we're going to provide. Also, some employers, such as Fujitsu, have used the Times Top 50 Employers for Women list of questions, because you are judged against 16 key areas, and they've used that to measure their progress. So you can also do that because it's in the public domain. You can also add different pay gaps that are not just gender pay gaps, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, and an action plan and a CEO statement. So moving on to the next slide, we can see that the gender pay gap figures, you can also use infographics to illustrate this, and it's much easier for people to understand the figures when they see them in infographics. So Unilever has done a really good work of putting their figures into infographics, so I really recommend you watch this. Also really interesting to watch the video by Sky on how they have really brought these figures to life with the different infographics, also showing the difference between median and mean, which can be quite difficult to explain. So it's quite important to explain the difference between the gender pay gap and unequal pay. And if you have not opted out of the list, we will send you all these materials later on. At Business in the Community, we are looking to develop a video that explains the difference between the gender pay gap and unequal pay, and you will be able to use the video freely with your employees. So that should be really helpful for you all. Looking at the additional gender pay gaps, I was quite proud that BITC was one of the first employers to publish that gender pay gap by ethnicity. So that means we looked at how BME women, so Black, Asian, and minority ethnic women, were doing against white women. In this case, actually, we found there was a difference of 2.9%. And if you look at the our gender pay gap, you can find a lot more detail about how we've done this. And actually, it's really helpful not just to look at the ethnicity pay gap, so what white employees are earning versus BME employees, but also to cut it down by different demographics. It could be that in your organization, Black women, for instance, are earning less than white men and white women. And it's quite important to have this data to basically devise your action plan and make it as bespoke as possible, and make sure you are helping the women who need it most as well in your organization. I would really encourage all employers to publish the gender pay gap by grade, because 9 in 10 employees want to see it. This is our research that found this. And also to look at the gender pay gap by employment pattern. So we find that women working part-time tends to have fewer career opportunities and development opportunities, and it's really important to understand what's going on in your organization. And even if you decide not to publish those pay gaps, it's really important to calculate them so that you can see year on year if you are improving. So in terms of other data you can give, workforce statistics is really helpful. So for instance, in this example, we can see this is a really good report by Nationwide, where they have one pager infographic, and you can see how they have mapped out the progression of women, which is also really helpful for employees to understand what is going on. So if we look at the internal communications and how you communicate your pay gap to employees, it's very important you communicate very wide and use all the platforms and channels you can. It's also very important that it is a two-way conversation. So to give you an example, when we published our gender pay gap at Business in the Community, we had a webinar with the head of HR that was here to help us understand the figures, answer any question we had, and it was a very open process and very transparent. So I would really encourage you to be as open and transparent as possible, so that people can ask you their questions around gender pay gap, but also what you are doing to tackle it. So with regards to the question of who should talk to employees, it's really important that senior executives do that, and we really encourage CEOs to send a message when the report is out, as opposed to just burying it. And we know that often around Christmas time, a lot of employers are publishing their figures. It's a pity, because it's a really good opportunity to also say what you are doing in your organization at the moment. Even if the pay gap may not have increased, there are 6 figures to look at, so it's not just one figure. What I would really encourage employers to do is to look at how the gender pay gap has evolved from last year. I think completely disregarding the figures from last year or pretending that they didn't exist is not necessarily helpful, and it's better to explain why the pay gap has increased or decreased, even if it's to say that it's a long-term process and it takes time. It's really important to refer to it as well. It's also really important to equip your line managers to deal with to know about the data, so that they are able to answer questions from your employees. So I would really encourage you to also do this when you are communicating your pay gap. With regards to media considerations, it's really good to publish a press release when you are communicating your pay gap, because at least in your press release, you can say what you are doing to address the pay gap. And that is very helpful. And we've had some companies publishing their pay gap before the official deadline. 11% of employers so far have published their pay gap. So that's probably why the pay gap is maybe more has maybe increased. It's not that it's increased. It's probably that those employers who are publishing are more transparent, more honest, and doing something about it. So I would really encourage you to also say what you are doing to address the pay gap, and maybe mentioning some of the key action in your action plans when you are doing this, because it really helps put it into perspective and giving also a link to your narrative. Tara, would you like to give us the case study of Network Rail very quickly?
Absolutely, yes. I think what you've just mentioned there, Chloe, Network Rail have done as well. They published a gender pay gap early last year. They've been doing a lot of work ahead of the gender pay gap reporting, and they were keen to highlight this. And they also wanted to maximise engagement both internally and externally. So they decided to publish in December 2018 last year. And a lot of the focus on they had a lot of focus on internal engagement. As you see there, they published an internal article, which was available to all employees. They provided supporting material to their HR networks across the business. They felt it was important for the various departments to understand the gender pay gap at a local level, so more targeted initiatives could be developed. So that's really important in engaging the wider business. And then they also created a short film clip which summarised the report and enabled them to communicate with clients, customers, and the public on social media and channels such as LinkedIn. And actually, you've mentioned Sky already, Chloe, and the video that they presented. And I'd also like to draw attention to Hilti. And Hilti published their gender pay gap narrative and action plan, and they had all the key components in there. They indicated that they understood their gender pay gap. They highlighted key areas that they were working on already and what they would do. But what they also did, which I thought was really powerful, was they had some success stories from employees. They had videos of success stories from employees who had taken up flexible working policies. And interestingly, it was a mix of male and female who'd taken up flexible working policies for various personal reasons. And I thought that was really powerful. And if you have those good stories to tell, I would urge you to tell them and include those in your narratives and action plan.
We've given you a lot of homework.
And absolutely.
And I would really recommend that you look at the gender pay gap reports by the Greater London Authority, Unilever as well, and the Ministry of Defence. These are some of my key sort of takeaways. Just to give you some information about business in the community, if you were interested in getting more support, we do review our members' narratives if they want us to help with looking at the way they have phrased their story and their action plan, and we obviously make sure that it's evidence-based and that is bespoke to their needs and their strategy. So do reach out if you are interested in getting more information about this. Also to say that we have 4 toolkits that are only for our partners, but 5 toolkits in total. So there is one you can access even though you're not a partner of business in the community. And they are really helpful to help you understand, analyze, communicate, and tackle your pay gap. And we look at it through the lens of attraction and recruitment and progression and retention when it comes to tackling the pay gap. We also use a lot of case studies and best practice examples. So really keep an eye out for this. If you are interested in partnering with us and you're not already a partner, the core partnership package is costed at £3,500, and this gives you access to all of the resources I've mentioned, but also, and most importantly, a dedicated expert advisor who works with you and provides you 1 day of tailored support and advice to help you, address any gaps you have and also access to our new benchmark system, which is called Diversity Intelligence, and will be launched later this year and will be extremely comprehensive to help you understand the factors behind your pay gap. So it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Please do reach out if you'd like more information. Thank you, Tara, for being such a brilliant co-presenter, and I've really enjoyed the session today. Do reach out.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you again for all the information you've given us today. I think it's really valuable. And I will follow up with the slide deck with all the links that we've both mentioned to the various action plans and guidance and webinars. And please do reach out and contact Chloe. We'll also provide email addresses for business community if you'd like to receive any further information from them. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Bye-bye.